Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, you guys, we're going to talk some more about Star Trek Picard. I am very excited to get to have these discussions with y'all at this point, and we're going to continue where we left off before. Today, we're going to start with Season 1, Episode 3, The End is the Beginning. So last time we finished episode 2, and we're going to move forward with episode 3. So episode 3 was also directed by Hanelle Culpepper, as I mentioned in the last episode, and it's pretty awesome as a kind of part 1 for setting up the new series, getting to know all of these new characters we'll be working with, and continuing on with the story. So, The End is the Beginning is the title of this episode, and it's kind of wrapping up some of the old strings that we had from the last set of Star Trek movies and TV shows that had Picard in them. And that's really awesome. So this episode is largely told in, kind of a sizable flashback as well regarding what happened between Picard and Raffi. So we meet Raffi at the end of the last episode, episode 2, in a kind of an intro that was reminiscent of Tremors in some ways. So there wasn't like a horror component, but I liked the style of introducing her out in the desert and everything, and her just not being super stoked to see him. So we love Jean-Luc Picard, and he's a great man. So it's very interesting in this episode how we get to see what happened before unfold. So in episode 3, we find that 14 years ago, Raffi and Picard were working on trying to suss out some Romulan rescue news. So Picard was her boss at the time, or her CO, I suppose, and was going to be asking Starfleet Command if they would go ahead and give them permission to go and rescue the Romulans. So we find them as Picard is coming out of the building, and she's clearly been waiting for him. And she's like, okay, so how did it go? And he's like, well, they rejected that initial thing. She's like, yeah, so then you led with this and this and this. So you can tell that they clearly had tried to work it out together beforehand too, and anticipate all of the eventualities and the issues that the command would possibly have against them going to help out the Romulans. And so she is just absolutely distraught that it's all been rejected at that point. And not only has it all been rejected, but they've also banned all synthetic life forms because of the uprising on Mars and the subsequent massacre associated with that, and that Picard finally had to use an ultimatum as his final card. And he said, okay, you can either let me go do this or you can accept my resignation. And they called his bluff and accepted his resignation. I also really enjoyed this bluff and poker theme that we have continuing from the very last episode of TNG, and in the first episode where we see that Data is holding 5 Queens of Hearts while they're playing at the very beginning of episode 1 of Picard, and again at this point. So this is largely about bluffs. We see a lot of bluffing going on throughout the first few episodes of Star Trek Picard, and we'll see that theme some more later. But he is resigned in protest, and then Rafi gets called in as well. And she's like, great, I'm going to get fired now because you decided to resign in protest. So that is why she's largely embittered against Picard at this point, because she was trying to help him with this Romulan rescue plan as well. And when he decided to submit his resignation with that ultimatum, which was not a step they had discussed before, she was fired as well. So his was a resignation, but she was kind of discharged from Starfleet Command in not a really great way. And it kind of ruined her life. She was much, much younger than Picard at that point. So we find that she comes to two conclusions when she finds out that he has been, let go, essentially. And one is that the Tal Shiar and Starfleet are both likely behind the synth's destruction on Mars and also shutting down the rescue mission for the Romulans. And she also knows with him out of a job, she will also be out of a job. So she is very correct, especially in regard to that second point. So we know that right away in the flashback. And we don't know what degree to which she is correct about the first part until now. So 14 years later, he's showing up at her door and letting her know, hey, you were right about that thing literally 14 years ago, like almost 2 decades ago, and it's time to really talk about it. So it was her initial idea that the Tal Shiar and Starfleet were in cahoots at that point in making that happen. And Picard was less likely to believe that at the time, but since he's met Daj and has learned more about Bruce Maddox, he has found that, she's probably right at this point and has shown up. So now it shows us back in the present of the show, and we see that Rafi's bitterness is also tied up in embarrassment and humiliation and a lot of anger. So it's a very complex emotion, which I really enjoy Michelle Hurd's portrayal of this because it seems very real. A lot of folks, when they feel embarrassed or humiliated, it's easier to turn it into anger. And bitterness is just prolonged anger that someone has stewed in, more or less. So she is really upset, and you can tell that she is using some types of drugs. We see her vape something. So she pulls a plant like a flower off of a local plant in her yard. And we can see it's probably what she's referring to when she says that snake leaf-induced paranoia might also have played a role in her becoming the person she is now, where she just drinks a lot and also vapes a lot. We don't know the degree to which she has been using these coping mechanisms until a later episode, but we can see that she's having a rough time and she is self-medicating in a way. Now, I am a big fan of getting to see that type of thing happen on screen because a lot of times in stories, our heroes are just perfect, And we just go, oh, okay, they're good because they're good. And that's as far as we get. I've said that to you guys before, and that's why I'm so interested in villains. But I'm also really interested in, anti-heroes. And Rafi, in this case, is a hero who's kind of fallen from grace, like Chris Hemsworth's character H in Men in Black, the new one, the most recent one. And in that one, we don't really get a great sense of who he was before because we don't get to see a lot of it. Although in Rafi's case, they're telling this story with what she's doing with her hair and her composure and her lifelong habits. They tell us a lot in this brief scene in the past between her and Picard and what we are seeing now. It's very brilliantly shown instead of told, and I am so far a big fan of Hannah Culpepper's storytelling, and also just Michelle Hurd's portrayal of Rafi. It's been really great so far, having seen the first few episodes. So at this point, we know that Rafi's having a really rough time, and that makes her a lot more interesting to me as a hero. Picard is also having a rough time because Starfleet's no longer Starfleet, and it's changed the entire course of his life. So this is really important for both of them, and the ways that they're dealing with it are very different. Picard, for the most part, has selected avoidance, and in Rafi's case, it is anger and unhealthy coping mechanisms. Neither of them are really using healthy coping mechanisms. She's turning to drugs and stuff like that, per se, but Picard has also chosen avoidance, which is not healthy either. Some of it's really reminiscent of Tony Stark to me, and I like seeing as we go along just how much this has really affected Rafi. Job loss is something that affects folks in everyday life, in real life, and it's a very simple thing to portray on television, but it's not something we tend to see a lot of, I don't think, particularly in sci-fi, which is funny because sci-fi tends to really manifest these allegories for us for regular life and for the things that are going on, but they tend to be more concentrated on socio-political or scientific or sociocultural interests. So I really enjoy that it's showing how this has affected Rafi regarding job loss and her concept of what her future would look like. I also like how they're doing that for Picard and showing how different people deal with things in different ways. But then again, Picard did offer that ultimatum, and he was a little more prepared for it, even if he didn't truly think that they would accept his resignation. Whereas Rafi did not start out that day being prepared to be fired. She thought that for sure Picard was well prepared for this meeting, and he was going to get what they were asking for. So this was a really hard turn for her. All right, we are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue talking about episode 3.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we are talking about how Picard and Rafi's relationship has changed over the years and how she and he are coping for similar reasons or similar causes, but in different ways. And I really enjoy how they are portraying that with job loss and how folks deal with that differently, also at different points in their lives. So he is quite a bit older than her. And, of course, he was prepared for resignation at that point in his life. He was an admiral. He had reached quite the heights of his career at that point. So even though he didn't want to leave, it wasn't as bad for him, I think, as it was for Rafi. It wasn't as jarring, I think, is a better word for it. So in this way, we see that Rafi has kind of fallen from grace quite a bit, and she is nurturing these feelings that she has that Picard hasn't checked up on her this whole time. And he's not Picard to her like he is to us. He's JL. He is her friend who she was very invested in this shared mission of wanting to save the Romulans and stuff with, and whom was directly responsible in a way for her being fired. So she has I think she's very validated in being upset with him. He was responsible for her getting fired, and he's not even checked on her since then. Now, we can tell from his reactions that a lot of that was due to guilt and shame on his behalf. And we see that this is another part of the trend of Picard feeling very responsible for failing people. It is the heavy burden of command. And not only did he lose Data, but he also essentially cost Rafi her job. And that is not something Picard is accustomed to. He is accustomed to doing everything right and still sometimes losing. That is a direct Picard quote that has affected a large portion of my life. So you can make no mistakes and still lose, and that is life. But in this case, it's not just affecting him, and it's not something Rafi did to herself. So this is a large component of who he is at this point in his life since he's left Starfleet 14 years ago. He has lost a lot of people, and he has been directly responsible from his point of view in regards to these people being lost, whether they are just in this long slide into humiliation and rage, as Rafi puts it, and also her being more or less addicted to drugs as well at this point. But it's a lot for him, and we see that he carries a lot of guilt for this as well. And indeed, in life, a lot of folks do feel guilt for not reaching out to folks, and that can lead to a lot of problems. So I've talked in the Health and Wellness podcast about that as well, where if your friend is going through something really rough, you might not know what to say, and so you say nothing, and then that makes it worse. And then after a while, you're like, wow, I didn't follow up on that. I didn't say anything. So now I feel like I really can't say anything. They probably hate me, and they're probably mad. But clearly, at this point, we can see that Rafi would have really liked for him to have reached out at some point, even if she was initially mad that his resignation had resulted in her being fired. She's still bitter about that at this point, but if he would have reached out to her sooner, then perhaps she would not have been as bitter as she is now, and they could have both recognized that it was not really Picard per se who was at fault for this. He was trying to do the right thing, and Rafi was trying to do the right thing, and when the Federation would not help them, he tried to force their hand, because that's what Picard does. Janeway would have done the same thing, except she still would have gone and immediately done it anyway, instead of waiting 14 years, because that's just how Janeway is. But Picard he's an honorable man, and so he feels the guilt deeply, and so he's let that stop him from reaching out to his friend, and so that is why they're so strained at this point. Now, at this point, we see that they used to be very close, not in a romantic way, but that they were good friends, and we want to see if they're going to be close again. So that is something that will probably be a big, major thing playing out as the season moves along, and I am excited to see that. I really love these types of wholesome relationships, so even though they're mad at each other right now, I still consider it pretty wholesome. They are a man and a woman being great friends with each other. I also love seeing on TV just two dudes having like a really wholesome relationship where they can talk to their bros about their feelings and stuff as well. Same with two women, or if you have like an adult and a kid and they have this super wholesome relationship of support and growth. I really enjoy seeing that on screen, and I think that that's what we'll really see more of as Rafi works through this bitterness and Picard works through his guilt in this friendship that they have together. We also at this point see that the Romulans are on that reclamation cube and are messing around with the Borg again. Now, we are at the point where Soji is meeting an ex-Borg legend, and it's Hugh. So you may remember Hugh from I, Borg, the episode of The Next Generation where they rescue him from a ship and then try to send him back with a virus to destroy the Borg. So I really like that they have brought Hugh back in here as well. And he looks a lot different at this point. He's had a lot of pieces removed from his body from where the Borg had given him implants. And so he looks quite a bit different than 7 of 9 does. He looks a little bit scarred and a little bit more hardcore at that point. So, of course, if you watch iBorg in Next Generation, they did not end up having him use the virus to destroy the Borg, and he is now here. So he seems to kind of be a Borg expert now. He does not encounter a ton of problems now, but that does not mean he did not have problems along the way. And he says that people either see us as property to be exploited or hazards to be warehoused. And then he says that the Romulans view them as both while he's talking to Soji. Because Soji has a good heart, and he can really recognize that in her. And he really enjoys seeing that because she's an anthropologist, and it makes it a lot easier for her to connect with them, even as they are different. Because as the anthropologist Ruth Benedict used to say, anthropology's purpose is to make the world safe for human differences. And in this case, she is an anthropologist where there are more than just humans at this point. And so Soji is there to make the world safe or the galaxy, universe even, safe for everyone's differences. And she can really appreciate the differences. It's not that she doesn't notice them. It's that she sees them and embraces them as they are. So at this point, he's really paying attention to her. He was really paying attention to Soji because she was speaking to the nameless, as they call them, in their native tongue and trying to provide solace, even though we're not sure that they can even hear her. It's a lot like speaking to coma patients from the perspective that we're given, but they're removing parts from his body, and she is trying to be supportive in that way and has bothered to learn the language. So Hugh really appreciates the heart that Soji puts into this as well. She has meaning and purpose in what she is doing. She's not just there to see the Borg, or the ex-Borg rather at this point, like Hugh, as being property to be exploited or a hazard to be warehoused. So the Romulans see them as both, and Soji sees them as neither, and that makes her very unique for the ex-Borg. At this point, Soji expresses interest in an ex-Borg named Rhonda, who is also Romulan. Rhonda had a big role before in the Romulan mythical stories and was a keeper of these stories, essentially. So she asked for permission to go talk to Rhonda, and Hugh kind of swayed from her empathy. It's like, okay, I'll go ahead and do that. So Rhonda seems to have a little bit more together than the other former drones, and Soji is picking up on some clues as to whether she could really have this conversation with her. She feels like she needs to know more, and she needs to seek out Rhonda. So Hugh tells her she can have 30 minutes with Rhonda and go from there. So they go into the chamber and try to initiate a conversation. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we will discuss what they find.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
before the break, we were talking about Soji's adventures on the Borg reclamation cube that the Romulans are running. So at this point, we know that Soji and Hugh are going to see Rhonda, a former Borg drone who is also Romulan. So as they walk into this area, you can see that it is protected by guards and a force shield as well, and that they are very much keeping them in there. The force shield is keep the ex-Borg drones, kind of contained, but they also are just mostly milling about in there. They're barely functional. It kind of gives you the impression of a psych ward that's portrayed on screen where a lot of folks are very much non-responsive. So in that way, we can see that there's not a lot going on in here, but comparatively, Rhonda is a little bit higher functioning. She's playing with some type of toy or like a card system. It looks a little bit like tarot, but they are triangle shaped, and it tends to form a hexagonal pattern, if I'm correctly recalling that, as she builds it out. So I really like that system that they have made for that, and how it also reminds me of the Borg cubes themselves, how all those pieces are fitting together to make a greater whole from the sum of its parts. So when she is looking at that, Soji sits down and starts talking to her and tries to speak with her in her native language as well to establish more of a connection. And Soji says that the Rhonda and the other ex-Borgs may be partaking in a shared narrative framework for understanding their trauma, rooted in deep archetypes, but as relevant as the day's news. So she refers to it as the news, which I feel we may see that repeated further down the line as we get through the rest of this season. So she's trying to process this information, but Rhonda suddenly kind of snaps a little bit. So she's still doing the tarot while Soji is talking to her and explaining her ideas and her concepts of what she's getting from Rhonda to Hugh, who is standing by watching, but Hugh is not trained in anthropology the same way that Soji is, so she's letting him know what she's finding, especially since he is also over her, and since he is the head of the ex-Borg program, he is able to give her permission to be in there, but he still is ranked quite a bit higher than her, so she would have to report it to him anyway. So she's just telling him in real time, and Soji's like, okay, so it's like the news, but it's also, the shared Borg framework. So that's really helpful for them. So they still may be somewhat connected, even though we've taken out a lot of their implants. So she starts to process this, and then Rhonda kind of snaps a little bit and starts freaking out. And she's like, I remember you from tomorrow. And Soji's like, what is happening? And starts asking these, crazy questions that are a little vague too. So she's like, which sister are you? Are you the one who dies? Or are you the one who lives? And we see on the board that where she is placed, that final piece right in the middle, that triangle is a small piece that has two women on it. And it looks like they're kind of almost back to back in a way. So it's symbolic of like sisters or twins. It made me think of like Geminis as well. And so that made me think of legacies and the Gemini coven as well. But also just in general, like the symbol for the Gemini for, just thinking about astrology and stuff in general. So in that regard, she's like, what is happening? We know that Soji was aware of being a sister as well, so it's a little bit jarring for her. And then Rhonda pulls a firearm, and everything goes kind of sideways for a second, but it's because one of the guards had come in there with their firearm on them, and so Hugh was like, hey, this is not Rhonda's fault, this is on the person who brought that in here, and they need to be reprimanded because they should know better, and make sure the rest of you do not have your firearms on you in here. These people are not stable. So I really like that indicates to us where Hugh's head is at in the game, and he is kind of meeting them at their level. he understands that they're having a hard time also because he was an ex-Borg. And I think that type of inclusivity is very important in general, but I like that we're seeing it mirrored on Star Trek. And I'm a little bit surprised that the Romulans are the ones modeling that, but it's just as pragmatic as it is inclusive. So the Romulans are not allowing Hugh to do this because of any type of inclusivity interests, but rather because he would understand better than anyone else. He would be an expert in this, and they understand that, even if they aren't necessarily on board with how much compassion he has towards them. So I like seeing that, and seeing that there are pragmatic reasons to do things and not to do things, very similarly to how John McCain and General Mattis took their approaches to understanding torture. So both John McCain and General Mattis were against torture, but John McCain was against it for moral reasons because he had also experienced it, whereas General Mattis was against it because it was not practical. They did a scientific study on it and found empirically that torture does not get you actual factual answers. At a certain point, people will say anything to you to get you to stop torturing them. So they may be telling you the truth, or they may just be admitting to things to get the pain to stop. So at that point, that is really reminiscent to me as to how the Romulans versus Hugh kind of view this. But in this case, the Romulans are just being pragmatic about it, like General Mattis. And Hugh is like, hey, I've been there. Morally, we have to treat them a certain way. And fortunately, they're just at the point where they both agree that Hugh is the expert on this. And although you can tell they don't want to let him and Soji through, and he has to assert his dominance and be like, hey, I am the head of this project, so I get to come through here. Step aside. And he doesn't even care that they're carrying disruptors and that Romulan disruptors don't have stun settings. He is just like, hey, let me through. I was part of the Borg collective. You guys are jerks, but you can't really scare me. So I really respect how we get to see who Hugh is at this point, and that he maintains his perspective even in really tense situations. So Hugh at this point and Soji end up leaving that area, and we go back to Earth. And we see that Picard is at his vineyard, and he and the two folks he lives with end up getting ambushed by the Zhat Vash. So remember, the Zhat Vash is the same as the Tal Shiar as far as Picard and them are concerned right now. And it gets really hardcore. I love how this scene plays out. You should definitely watch it. It is visually so interesting, and it tells us a lot about the characters and where they are now, where they're showing us Picard's physique and what he's capable of at this point, and how he handles a weapon versus his physicality in hand-to-hand combat. We're learning a lot about what is going on with him and his health, and I like that he gets to be an old man, and you really get to see how his age is affecting him. I think a lot of times we just expect older characters to still be tough and everything in the exact same ways that we would younger characters. And so we either don't see older action stars or they aren't that realistic. But I like how Picard really approaches that as a show. So the Zhat Vash are in a battle with them, and Dr. Jurati pops in, Agnes, and she's just like freaking out because she accidentally kills a Romulan at that point because she didn't know there wasn't a stun setting. But we see that they try to talk to the Zhat Vash about what's going on. They try to interrogate him, and he kills himself with that acid that we had seen happen to Dosh when a Romulan, spit on her. Now, if those two halves of the story are going to come together, it will be somewhere down the line in the rest of the show, and I'm really excited to see what they do with that. So it looks like at this point they've decided they're going to need a starship and a pilot. And before Rafi told Picard to, get off my lawn, she also was like, I will have a pilot reach out to you. And so she does get him a pilot. And we meet him in the form of Chris Rios, played by Santiago Cabrera. And I loved him immediately. We're going to go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about Chris.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about what was going on in the Borg Reclamation Cube and how Picard was attacked at his own vineyard with his friends while the Zhat Vash dropped in. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the pilot that Raffi has recommended to Picard. We meet him on his ship and we learn a couple things about him. He is hardcore. He reminds me a little bit of Han Solo in some ways. And he sometimes gets injuries that he's not really that upset about. We first meet him with a giant piece of metal coming out of his shoulder, or glass, can't remember which, but he has a giant shard in his shoulder, and he has a hologram who is his EMH. So his EMH is very similar in the way that we are familiar with the Doctor from Voyager, and the EMH is trying to help him. But interestingly, the EMH also looks very much like him. So I like where they're going with this. And, he's like, okay, you pulled the thing out, get away from me with the hypo spray and stuff. I'll be fine. I don't need you to heal me right now. So he doesn't mind scars. He doesn't mind the other stuff. He's just kind of gruff. He's prickly on the outside. But Picard kind of assesses him and is like, I think that this man is still Starfleet through and through. He used to be Starfleet, and you can tell he was ex-military because of the way everything in here is cared for and how everything is put away in ship-shape condition. The guy clearly is working on his own for the most part, with the exception of the hologram that he has, but he is taking great care to maintain the ship himself. So Han Solo also maintained his ship himself, the Falcon, along with Chewie, but Han had a lot of trouble with that. We also can contrast that a little bit with Malcolm Reynolds and the Serenity. So, try as Mal might, he has to employ Kaylee to keep the Serenity up and running, and that's totally fine, but they are not getting a lot of tools for caring for the ship, and you can really tell. And Kaylee's always just going, everything's shiny, Captain, because she is doing the best that she can with what is available to her. Similarly to Han and Chewie, just doing the best that they can, but their ships are very different in comparison with Chris's. So Captain Rios, Chris, is, he's rough and tumble like Mal and Han, but he's more military. Han was not military. He wanted to be, but he was not able to be. And Mal served in a form of rebellion, similarly to how Han does later on. So they are a little bit different in their approaches because Chris was straight up Starfleet. So we now have a couple people who are ex-Starfleet at this point, and I really enjoy that because they're not bound by the same rules, but they also have a shared component of who they are as people. At their core, they are still Starfleet officers, and that is what Picard verbally observes to Chris at a certain point. He's also very much likes to read. Chris cares about philosophy and stuff. He's very quiet about it, though. He just wants to sit there and read his book. And in that way, he reminds me a bit of General Mattis as well, the warrior monk. So I like this concept. I can't really imagine Han Solo picking up a philosophy book, but it is very interesting to see how they are building Captain Rios from the ground up in this way. He's a very complex character, and I really appreciate that. So in this capacity, we see that he has a grudge against Starfleet, and, Picard thinks it's a failed idealism, and he can really identify with that. His last captain also died horribly, and it was very sad for him, and now his entire crew is emergency holograms. So they all look like him, but they have their own personalities. So it's super cool to me to see that. So he has like a hospitality one that helps Picard get his room set up and everything. He has the EMH one. He has several. We just keep meeting holograms as we go, and they all look like him. I absolutely love how they're treating that. And in some ways it reminded me a little bit of Andromeda, but with Andromeda it's just, the one hologram really, Andromeda. But I love seeing representations of ships or of components of ships in that way. So Chris says that the ship came with that package. I don't know why they look like him, per se, but it's very interesting to see how they act, because they do seem to have personalities of their own that remind me of the Doctor, who was the EMH in Voyager. It's really interesting to see that, because the other EMHs, or not EMHs, but the other holograms that we have met so far, kind of are devoid of personality. They are more similar to the sense that did the uprising on Mars. They're not like the Doctor at all. So, especially with this ban on synthetics I think only include androids. They don't really include holograms. But it's interesting to see them having a personality at this point, because the one in the vault did not have one. It was just like talking to, Alexa, rather. So Alexa will say some sassy things sometimes in response to you, but they're just pre-programmed responses. Whereas these holograms, particularly the EMH, really seem to have a personality and real reactions of their own. It's not program responses. So I like how that works out. It reminds you a little bit of Inside Out. If you guys watched that cartoon, I really enjoyed that, and seeing how the different emotions inside of the kid's head, Riley's head, really played out together. And we don't get to see the EMHs, or the EMH and the other holograms really interact with each other, but they are all different types of like emergency holograms that pop up. I like this kind of concept too, that we see that Chris is similar to Picard in a few ways. He's upset and has a grudge against Starfleet, but also he has some sense of guilt and responsibility for what happened to his last captain. And it's kind of the other side of the coin. So Picard was the captain or the admiral who was in charge of the others and lost them. But Chris, we get the sense, was more like the number one, and he has lost somebody and he felt responsible for it. So now he doesn't even have a crew of his own. Everyone on board is a hologram. And in that way, I think that, he's working through his own tragedy as well. He's not just angry and bitter about Starfleet, but he has his own personal tragedy that we'll hopefully get to delve into more as we go along. Now, that component of the episode is super fun. I can't wait to see how many holograms Chris has just hiding around the ship. I'm sure he probably has a cook. Well, I guess he wouldn't have a cook anymore. I'm thinking about Neelix, but that's because they were in the Delta Quadrant and we're having some replicator issues. Chris probably just uses the replicator at that point, because he does not seem to like the holograms, although I don't think that it's that he doesn't like them, is that he's scared to get attached to anything else at this point in his life. So he's really abrupt, and the holograms are like, he hates me. It's really funny. The one of them outright is like, he hates me, so I just kind of stay out of sight. It's like when Han is talking to C-3PO and stuff, and he's like, shut up, and he's like, shutting up, sir. So I think it's really hilarious. But if you guys are into that kind of thing, you may really enjoy this new character and this new ship. I think that they're giving us just enough information as we go along to keep it interesting and also mysterious. So once we get to this point, we see that Rafi is also on the ship. So Picard's roommates/friends, who are also Romulan, decide to stay at the vineyard and keep an eye on the grapes and everything. But Picard is on this voyage with Captain Rios and all of his holograms. And Rafi is there when he beams aboard. So he's surprised to see her, especially because she's grumpy about it. But she's like, I'm not here for you. I am not on this journey for you. I have my own thing that I'm doing and my own reasons for being here. So don't get attached. Don't think that we're rekindling this friendship. I'm just going in the same direction as you. And we also see that Agnes has come with him. So Agnes begged him on his vineyard to let him go with her following her conversation with Commodore O. And she is like, let me go with you. This is something I've dreamed of my entire life. I used to work with Bruce Maddox, and this is what we were living our lives for, trying to create a new synthetic that was organic in nature. And here we are. So she has found that this is possibly, her holy grail. So she decides to go along with him. Picard's like, okay, you're the foremost expert in the galaxy right now, as far as he knows, at least within the Federation, on synthetics, and you can come with me. So this is our new crew. So we have Dr. Agnes Jurati, an expert on synthetics, so very similar to like Khan Noonien Sung. But also we have Captain Rios and all of his holograms, and we have Rafi, as well as Picard. So that is who is on the ship at the time that we get to move forward, and we get that huge payoff of getting to hear Picard say, engage, at that point. So it's really nice and heartwarming, and I love that they do it at the end of the episode, and it really leaves a great impact on you from it. It's been very satisfying to watch, and they've done a great job in staying close to the source material while making its own thing. So it is really doing a great job with the continuity of all the other Star Treks, but also while creating its own distinct type of feel for what's going on. So I love what they're doing with it so far. We are going to go ahead and go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk a little bit more about that source material that they're referencing. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the new crew that is making up the rest of the folks on the ship in Star Trek Picard. Although Picard is letting Captain Rios/Chris really be the pilot and in charge of everything, he is still getting to say his trademark engage quote. So I am really excited to see that. But he does recognize, this is Rios' ship. I'm going to be respectful. But Rios lets him say it anyway, and that's chill. And I mean, to be honest, who would try to stop Captain Picard from saying engage? If I was on that ship and that was my ship, I'd be like, all right, you say whatever you want, man. I am in the presence of a Starfleet Federation hero. So that would not bother me one bit. And it doesn't seem to really bother Rios either. He's definitely confident and secure that it is his ship. But he's okay, therefore, with letting Picard do that as well. So that was a great payoff. And we're really getting to see this show bridge the gap between the Next Generation and the movies that were associated with it, as well as the Kelvin timeline from the most recent Star Trek movies. So I am talking about Chris Pine's Star Trek movies. Now, regardless of how you feel about those, they are canon, and we have to live with them. As my ex used to say, nope, it's out there, and now we have to live with it. And he was always saying that jokingly. So whenever I think about that, I think it applies to this too. Granted, the Kelvin timeline is an alternate reality. That is okay. It's really less of an alternate reality and more of an alternate timeline. I digress. Those do mean different things, though, in sci-fi, different alternate realities versus an alternate universe versus an alternate timeline. So I'm going to refer to it as an alternate timeline, despite what most other sites really reference it as. But the Kelvin timeline is different from our timeline, the Prime timeline, in that there was an explosion on Romulus, or rather in the Romulan star system, and it was the Romulan sun that really supernovaed. That was the big problem. If you watch Stargate, then you know the chaos that can come from someone blowing up a sun, as Samantha Carter has done that, and so has Rodney McKay, and he took out the entire solar system all at once. But if you take out the sun, you are going to destroy life on those other planets. So, the planets in that star system were totally screwed over when the Romulan sun went supernova. And that totally checks out with what we saw Spock convey to Kirk in the movies. So in the movies, Spock does a mind meld with Kirk and kind of shows him what was going on, and he sees that there's a star that explodes. Suns are stars, you guys, and that is quite alright. This is not a retcon. One site referenced it as a retcon, and they're like, I guess this makes more sense. No, I mean, a star is a star is a star. So a sun is a star. It is okay. So what is a star? Why is our sun a star? Our sun is a star because it produces energy through a fusion reaction of gases. In our case, helium turning into hydrogen. So it's a star. That's okay. It's not a retcon, so we don't have to be upset about that. They just referenced it as a star before, and now we know that the specific star was the Romulan sun. So when the Romulan sun went ahead and supernovaed, even though Spock was trying to prevent it, he and Nero got sent into an alternate timeline with the help of that red matter as well, and then we got the Kelvin timeline. So what we're seeing now with Picard is not what happens in the Kelvin timeline. It's not in the Kelvin timeline at all. It's in the Prime timeline. But we're seeing what happened in the Prime timeline, our regular Star Trek timeline, because of that break-off point, that forking point of those timelines where Spock tried to prevent it, but essentially failed and initiated the Kelvin timeline. So we are at like a fork in the road, and because it's no longer just linear for that, we have the new movies that are in the Kelvin timeline, and this is the fallout of what happened in the Prime timeline as a result of that forking. So instead of the Federation going and helping Romulus as part of the Federation, they forsake them. And that totally checks out with what Nero had said. So in this way, it makes Nero's story make a lot more sense. And I really appreciate how they did this. Alex Kurtzman has said that they were not at all trying to make Picard part of the Kelvin timeline or even address it when they started out, but that it just happened to perfectly match up with everything that Picard had been involved with in TNG and everything that was going on in the Kelvin timeline in order to make Picard sort of a bridge between the two. But we're just checking out what's going on with the bridge. And by bridge, I'm like, an Einstein-Rosen bridge. It's letting us know what's happening in space-time between these two, almost like a wormhole between the Kelvin timeline and the regular Prime timeline that we were accustomed to, although this is still the Prime timeline. And as Teal'c says, the only timeline that matters is our own. Whether you believe in that or not is up to you. But in this case, we are seeing what happened here. And I'm very stoked to see that. Perhaps if that had not happened, then things would have been different and Picard would still be in Starfleet. But that would be much less interesting, I think. He would probably just be teaching at this point or be involved in administration as an admiral instead of being out here doing these shenanigans. He needs a cause to fight for, and this really gives it to him. We also get more involvement with the Romulans, which is really great right now because that makes a lot of sense with the Kelvin timeline. And also we're seeing more of the Klingons, even though they don't look like Klingons, in Star Trek Discovery. Star Trek Discovery, for me, I really like it a lot, but it does feel a little bit like someone pitched a sci-fi show and then we're told, okay, yeah, we'll take it, but only if you make it Star Trek. And they're like, well, it cost us a lot of money to do the makeup the way we did, so we're just not going to do that. We're not going to redo that. We're not going to refilm it. And they're like, okay, that's just what Klingons look like now. Now I have my own feelings about that, but largely, I'm okay with it. It's whatever at this point. I'm not going to let that trip me up because there's so much good stuff about Discovery that I do love. But I do get why people are bothered by that. It also bothers me. And it bothers my buddy Mike. We're two huge sci-fi fans, and we have talked about that at length. We both agree. It just looks like somebody was like, okay, yeah, this is a sci-fi show. And they're like, oh, that's cool, but we want the label of Star Trek to carry it. So there's that. But if you guys haven't watched Discovery, I encourage you guys to check it out. It's okay that it's shortened to disco, and that sounds silly. It's fine. It's also fine that if you really shorten it all the way down, it's like STD. But, you know, we don't call Voyager STV. We do refer to Deep Space Nine as DS9, but it's not STDS9. So we can make the jokes about it, but in reality, they don't really hold water if we're using them to stay mad about it. And it's okay if you do watch it and you decide it's not for you. That's fine. Not everything is for everyone. I like Picard already way better than I liked DS9, although I liked DS9, and I liked who Sisko was as a leader as well, but he just wasn't my favorite leader. So I like this ragtag group of folks, even though it is so much of a departure from previous forms of Star Trek, but not really in some ways. So in Voyager, Janeway merges the Voyager crew with the Maquis, and they were different factions, and they both become Starfleet. And in this way, Picard is a little bit of an inverse of that, where these people were from different walks of life, science, and also Starfleet as a shared past, and now they are rogue. So I dig it. I am totally here for it. And I think that if you guys give Picard a shot, you may like it as well. It has a lot going on regarding all the new stuff that they are approaching, and I love this new concept of almost like a Romulan prophet. I mean, we've seen that with the Vulcans and stuff before as well, so it's not like that new, but I love that she was a Borg as well. That's so complex. Before, we've had a couple of ex-Borg with like Hugh and Seven of Nine and, you know, little baby Borgs like Icheb as well. And this is just a really different take on it. So I really like where they're going with it, and the focus is different, even though we are so accustomed to all these different types of characters. And I think it's one of the greatest strengths of Star Trek Picard. It still feels very, very Star Trek. So I get why Disco doesn't feel as Star Trek, but Picard really, really does. I like them both for different reasons. But it's very exciting to me to see where this goes. We also have them being aboard the Artifact and getting to see some background between Narek and his sister. So there is a lot going on here. I am going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up talking about Picard.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Star Trek Picard and how things were going along with bridging the Kelvin and Prime timelines. I think it's really exciting to see how far it goes, and we're getting some really diverse characters in this new story. They're very complex, and there's a lot going on. They're all very unique in their own ways, even though they share several traits. How they deal with things is different. One of these that I really enjoy is Rios. Now, I love a lot of these new characters, actually. It's really hard to pick a favorite. But I'm really interested to see how things work out for Rios as well as for Michelle Hurd's character, Rafi. I really want to get to know them more. So Rios's reading material that Picard sees him with is a book called The Tragic Sense of Life. It's written by the Spanish writer Miguel de Unamuno y Hugo and was published in 1912. So it's about the philosophy he has figured out after trying out the era's prominent movements, and is pretty much that death in itself makes life tragic, but it's also inevitable. So it's important to seek out the wisdom that is involved in that tragedy. And that the wisdom is kind of like culture in the way that it is super organic. It is both surrounding and beyond and reinforcing that tragedy. It's a result of it, but also is beyond it in a way. So to develop a tragic sense of life would be seen as admirable in this way. So I think it's very interesting. It's kind of a cousin of Stoicism in a way as well. And I like that he is reaching towards philosophy even as he is avoiding making new friends and establishing new intimate relationships with anyone. And by intimacy, I don't mean like romantic intimacy, even though he does very much come off as a loner. He is quite attractive, and he has that roguish thing going on that Mal Reynolds and Han Solo have. But also, Rios seems like he's very much a loner in a way that is different from them. He looks like he has the capacity to be a Lando Calrissian, but he is not that type of person. He's rather turned inward in this way and would not really welcome the company of other humans for a lot of different aspects of his life. He's not even stoked that there are so many people on his ship, and there's only 3 people on his ship aside from him right now. So in this way, he's quite a bit different, and I like that he's kind of turning to philosophy for it. It just makes him a lot different in that aspect. And I think that he will find a lot in common in that regard with Captain Picard / Admiral Picard / JL, as we are calling him in this new series. So I think that has a lot to build upon, and it also reminds me a bit of classic novels like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I'm really stoked to see where he takes this. Rios doesn't really seem to care in particular where they're going or why they're going there. He's like, whatever, you're paying me, and that's all I need to know, and he's totally fine with that. He's also like, don't talk to me, which I really identify with from who I was as a person last year and who I was as a leader at that point, where I'm like, I want to help you cultivate your skills as a person, but also I value my alone time. I don't necessarily want to sit here and chit-chat when it's not time for your performance review. I am busy doing things, and I'm working on personal development in addition to your professional development and my own. So don't talk to me before noon. And if it's just to wish me a good day, I will just assume that you want me to have a good day. You don't need to tell me that. Now, I'm a bit softer at this point. I'm more gooey than I am prickly, but I really identify with the prickliness that Rios is exhibiting here. But I think he's going to be like what Alan Watts referred to as being a prickly goo. And at a certain point, we're going to see the gooiness of him. And it's going to be, I think, similar in a way to Jack O'Neill, where it is coming from a place of trying to protect himself because he has lost something significant to him, and he's not dealing with it well. He's very strongly impacted by it, and that's okay. Jack O'Neill is very much from the school of Stoicism in a lot of ways, and also making his enemies really underestimate him by being silly and trying to draw the attention to himself to prevent others from being harmed. Now, none of these people on Rios' ship are under his command. They're on board his ship, but they're not his crew, per se. They're more like passengers, the way that Luke and Obi-Wan initially were for Han Solo when he picks them up at the Mos Eisley Cantina at Docking Bay 94. So I think that it's really interesting the way that this is developing, because we know that Han later on gets really attached to them, just like Mal Reynolds gets attached to his passengers, even while he's being really prickly about it. Han is prickly, and so is Mal, and we're going to see that a lot with Rios as well, but it's largely someone pretending to be unaffected in order to protect themselves. So I am excited to see how that turns out, and I think that it's going to be super interesting. I think they also have a lot in common with Jack O'Neill, and those are just kind of my favorite characters, you guys. Those are my favorite characters in general, where they're kind of grouchy and stoic, but they're gooey inside, like Indiana Jones. Really, do I just love Harrison Ford? Perhaps. That could very well be true. But my point is that there are a lot of strong influences here and corollaries to other shows that I've seen, while Rios is at the same time very well written as being his own character, and he's very well portrayed. I am so happy with this new crew, and I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, because it's very much not Starfleet, but they know enough about Starfleet in the past to be able to put a lot of things aside and go, okay, there is a ranking officer who knows some more about this than I do. So, Picard has an entire maneuver named after him called the Picard maneuver. It would be crazy for Rios to not take his advice at certain points, although we have not really seen that happen yet. We haven't seen them butt heads really over anything. But I think that as a Starfleet officer, Rios would, he might bristle at this point because he's no longer Starfleet, but I think that ultimately he would recognize chain of command issues and how it's important to have one person in charge of that to really get the point across and to make command decisions in the moment. Because when you're in the middle of a firefight, it's not a democracy. That is not going to serve anyone. You need straight up orders. You need everyone to be on the same page regarding what is going on and what is about to happen. And I think that is going to come across really well with these folks having been previous Starfleet. Now, Agnes, that's a whole different ball of worms. Or can of worms, barrel of monkeys, all those things. A barrel of worms at this point. She is not military. She is very much a scientist, so she's kind of our Daniel Jackson in that regard, but she is not an anthropologist. She is just a straight-up geneticist, more or less, who is trying to create synthetic life forms. So not quite geneticist, but it gets a little bit fuzzy because we are dealing with positronic neurons at this point and replicating those positronic neurons to extrapolate an individual data, their memories, and who they are as a person, their wealth of knowledge, as well as their experiences and trying to turn that into multiples. So, I mean, it makes sense. I think that they're trying for like a mitosis type of symbology for it. And when you see Soji/Daj's necklaces, each girl has the same necklace, you see that they look very similar to a Venn diagram with like a mandorla, but it also looks like mitosis when those cells are separating from each other. So I really enjoy the symbolism in here, and I like where they're going with everything. Now, I don't know if snake leaf is, legal in the Federation. I'm not sure where the Federation stands on certain types of drugs at this point, but who knows? Rafi may be using medicinal snake leaf, or she may be growing it clandestinely out in the desert, and that's why she's there. Who knows? Maybe that's just where she was initially from. But regardless, Rafi has decided she wants to be in a different part of the galaxy and is on the same voyage as Picard and Agnes. So Agnes is there for curiosity. Rios is there because why not? He's a pilot. That's what he does. And Picard is on a mission based on morality and this dedication to finding what he believes is like Data's offspring. He wants to find that piece of Data. We can tell in the flashbacks he misses him deeply and he carries that guilt. So I think it's partly to assuage his own guilt by protecting what he perceives as Data's daughter, who he does not know his name is Soji yet, I don't believe. But he is trying to find her and protect her because he failed Data and he failed Daj, the other daughter, at that point. And Agnes is there for curiosity, and Rafi is there for an as of yet unknown reason. We know that she has a reason to want to be off planet, but she is still mad at Picard, and she's not going to confide in him about that. Rios doesn't care, and Agnes can ask, but Rafi is not inclined to tell. So that is where we're at for Star Trek Picard up through episode 3. The next 2 episodes are directed by Jonathan Frakes. As you guys know, that was Riker in TNG and the associated movies. So I'm very excited to see Jonathan Frakes' work here as a director. I love episodes of other sci-fi series that he's directed over the years, and am stoked to see how well his visual style meshes with Hannah Culpepper's as we go for a cohesive look at the new Star Trek Picard series. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.